Shinobi, organizers with the Answer Coalition. Tonight's event is brought to you by the Answer Coalition, which stands for Act Now to End War and Racism. Rooted in international solidarity, Answer has been fighting against imperialism for over 2 decades, connecting the fight for social justice here in the U.S. to the fight against U.S. wars and occupation abroad. Answer has organized mass protests against the war in Iraq and Afghanistan, the occupation of Palestine, attacks on Syria, Yemen, Pakistan, Iran, and Somalia, against U.S.-backed regimes in Haiti and Libya, and illegal blockades against Cuba and Venezuela. Answer has also played a major role in the fight against racist police brutality, racist immigration policies and enforcement, and the exploitation of workers here in the United States. The United States military is the world's largest polluter, producing more hazardous waste than any country and more environmental poisons than the 5 largest U.S. chemical companies combined with full impunity. We recognize that imperialism is an environmental issue. For the planet to live, capitalism and imperialism must end. For more information on our work and how to get involved, please sign up for our email and phone notifications. Check out our website, answercoalition.org. Follow us on social media at Answer Coalition and speak to one of our organizers here today. Tonight's program will begin with a presentation by Climate Solutions author Tina Landis, followed by a question and answer session. We encourage you to stay after the Q&A to connect with our organizers in the fight against climate change. We study together so we can struggle together and win. We have copies of Climate Solution for sale here today as well near the entrance. Now we are honored to introduce Tina Landis. Tina Landis is the author of the book Climate Solutions Beyond Capitalism. Woo! Yeah. Tina is the author of the book Climate Solutions Beyond Capitalism. She works in air quality regulation and climate protection and holds a certificate in sustainable management from UC Berkeley. She is a founding member of the Party for Socialism and Liberation and writes regularly on climate issues for the PSL's publication, Liberation News. The Party for Socialism and Liberation is a working class party of leaders and activists from many different struggles, founded to promote the movement for revolutionary change and socialist transformation of society. For more information on PSL, check out our website at pslweb.org, where you can sign up for email newsletters, be connected to PSL, a PSL branch or PSL organizers near you, and purchase other books and magazines by PSL members. You can also follow our work at social media PSL Web and read more articles and statements at liberationnews.org. Tonight's session will be led by Tina's presentation, followed by a 20-minute Q&A session. Thank you. Tina, take it away.
Thank you all for coming out. It's so great to be here with you in person. So there are real solutions to climate change that could end the crisis within just 1 generation, but you'll never hear that from the corporate media because the transformations required would spell the demise of capitalism. Globally, our climate is unraveling at an accelerating rate, with higher temperatures and more extreme weather occurring each year. And this unraveling is impacting the poorest of the world most. Despite the increasing urgency, we see little to no action from capitalist governments. In order to keep warming to no more than 1.5 degrees Celsius, which is needed to avoid catastrophe, greenhouse gas emissions need to be reduced by 45% by 2030 and reach net zero by 2050. And this target is based on the consensus of thousands of international scientists whose research informs the UN climate reports. The UN report from early April called out governments and corporations for lying about their emission reduction measures and warned that existing and planned fossil fuel production have us on track to surpass 3 degrees Celsius warming, which would mean an uninhabitable planet. And this is not a threat that's far into the future. If we stay on the current course, most people alive today will see temperatures reach dangerous levels in our lifetimes, if they haven't already. And the evidence is impossible to deny. No matter where you live on the globe, climate change is becoming increasingly apparent and more destructive, from more severe wildfires, extreme drought, floods, and heat waves, to more frequent and destructive storms, to the weakening jet stream that's bringing Arctic temperatures south. All of these things are symptoms of a destabilizing climate. Global temperatures are rising each year along with concentrations of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And this, in combination with ecosystem destruction, is causing a chain reaction that impacts the air and water currents globally and triggers these extreme weather anomalies. And fossil fuel emissions are only part of the equation. Industrial agriculture and ecosystem destruction also adds CO2 and other greenhouse gases to the atmosphere. When forests are cleared or soil is tilled or wetlands, mangroves or peatlands are uprooted, all the carbon that was stored in the plants in the soil is then released into the atmosphere. And trees literally make rain and maintain the small water cycle. So as land is cleared for agriculture and development, this water cycle is disrupted, which is causing this current cycle of droughts, fires, and floods. So just shifting off fossil fuels alone will not solve the crisis. We need to also keep ecosystems intact and regenerate what has been destroyed. And in general, we must scale down humanity's impact on the planet. And biodiversity is a key climate stabilizer. In a healthy ecosystem, every species of plant, animal, and fungi plays a role in creating the most optimal conditions for all life in the system to thrive. This co-creative system produces oxygen, soil nutrients, cools air temperatures, and creates rain. When biodiversity loss occurs, the entire system is weakened and is less able to survive, particularly under the current climate stressors. And despite the dominant narrative of human superiority, we cannot mimic this co-creative life support system through technological innovation. The transformation that is needed is one of returning to a reciprocal relationship with life on the planet, rather than an exploitative one that colonialism and capitalism brought about. Indigenous communities largely still have that co-creative relationship and respect for the natural world, which is evident when you look at the data. Indigenous held territories make up 20% of the Earth's landmass and hold 80% of remaining biodiversity. This is due to a deep understanding of local ecology, as well as land management practices that support biodiversity for the benefit of all species. And all of humanity used to have this reciprocal relationship with the natural world before being forcibly removed from our lands, starting with feudalism through the rise of capitalism. To truly solve the climate crisis, partnerships with indigenous peoples across the globe are key to healing our relationship with the natural world through their deep ancestral knowledge of ecology, which Western science has only begun to scratch the surface of. So how did capitalism cause the climate crisis? First, capitalism commodifies everything on the planet. The land itself, the minerals in the earth, the water, the trees, the plants that we eat, and the animals that are sold as food. This commodification of the natural world has led to the complete or near extinction of many species throughout the history of capitalism, from the decimation of whale populations killed for oil in the 1800s to industrial fishing today that kills untold numbers of sea life just to plunder those most profitable, to the collateral damage wrought by the production of cash crops like palm oil that destroys vital habitats. The earth is seen by the capitalists as a resource to be exploited until there are no more profits to be made, like a gold rush on life itself. Another way that capitalism is the cause of the crisis is a system of overproduction and the free market, where what is produced, how much is produced, what materials are used, and how much waste is created is a decision that's made by the corporations based on what is most profitable, meaning using the cheapest materials and labor with complete disregard for the long-term implications. This production model is immensely wasteful, where food, clothing, and other products are destroyed because they can't be sold at a profit, regardless of need. This irrational system can never be environmentally sustainable, but is the complete antithesis of sustainability and is controlled by the billionaire owners. Just 100 companies are responsible for 71% of greenhouse gas emissions since 1988. 13 major corporations are responsible for the majority of deforestation globally. And just in 2019 alone, 50 top investment banks funded ecosystem destruction globally through $2.6 trillion in investments, just in 1 year. And 1 in 4 congresspeople have personal investments in fossil fuels, and it's not just Republicans. In 2020, Biden had the second largest campaign donations from fossil fuel corporations, second only to Trump. And the 1% richest people on the planet are responsible for emissions equal to that of the poorest 50% of the world's population. The capitalist ruling class is literally driving us to extinction. But we have to remember we are the majority and we do have the power to change it when we organize ourselves into collective action. And US leaders love to point the finger at China for the problem. But the imperialist countries, primarily the US and Europe, are responsible for the largest share of cumulative emissions since the Industrial Revolution, with the US responsible for 27% and Europe 25%. And this doesn't even account for emissions from the US war machine, which are exempt from UN reporting, despite the fact that the Pentagon is the largest consumer of fossil fuels on the planet and the largest unregulated polluter. In order to maintain global dominance, the US must maintain its fossil fuel addiction to fuel the military-industrial complex. Estimates show that greenhouse gas emissions tied to the Pentagon equal that of 140 countries combined. And that's not even mentioning the incalculable environmental destruction wrought by US military operations around the globe. Also, the calculated emissions from the US and other global north countries don't account for the outsourcing of production of goods that are consumed here within the global north. For instance, how much of China's emissions are actually from the production of goods consumed here? Which is why the climate justice movement must also be anti-imperialist, because policies of control by the global north are driving this crisis. And even without accounting for emissions from military and outsourcing, the US still has the largest per capita emissions today. Global South countries hold much less responsibility for the problem historically and today. Yet climate change is impacting countries of the Global South more severely due to the legacy of colonialism and imperialism that has created a development gap that must be addressed by those most responsible. But instead, US and NATO policies continue to divide the world. These divisive policies from imperialist governments are the opposite of what is needed if we have any hope of ending the climate crisis and achieving sustainable development globally. And not only is the majority of humanity's carbon footprint concentrated in the global north, but also at the top within the ruling elite, well beyond the control of working class individuals who are told that if we just buy an electric vehicle and recycle more, the crisis will be solved. But this is false and a deflection of blame from the real source, the system itself. And of course, we should all strive to conserve more and attempt to lessen our impact on the environment, but our individual lifestyle choices do little to impact the root cause of climate change. Under capitalism, climate actions are limited to piecemeal solutions like regulations on industry and subsidies and incentives for corporations to do the right thing, or emissions are monetized through carbon markets. All of these tactics have so far failed to result in any significant emission reductions and only serve to maintain the status quo while giving the perception of change. Luis Arce, socialist president of Bolivia, summed it up well in his speech at the UN Climate Summit in November when he said, quote, "We perceive that developed countries are simply buying time without any sense of responsibility for humanity. Developed countries are promoting a new world recolonization process that we can call the new carbon colonialism, because they're trying to impose their rules of the game in the climate negotiations to continue feeding the new green capitalist system, while pushing developing nations to accept these rules of the game without any other options. The solution to the climate crisis is not going to be achieved through more green capitalism and more global carbon markets. The solution is to change the model of civilization and move towards an alternative model to capitalism, the concept of living well together in harmony with Mother Earth," unquote. Under capitalism, the tools to address climate change are limited, as is the power of the government to impose restrictions on industry. While the recent Supreme Court ruling that limits the power of the EPA to regulate carbon emissions is a setback, regulatory mechanisms under capitalism are a far cry from what is needed to stem the climate crisis. Even before the ruling, US greenhouse gas emission reductions were nowhere near where they should be in order to achieve net zero emissions by 2050. And there is no plan from the government of how to get there. Instead of regulations and corporate incentives, we need direct government control to reduce emissions in the urgent timeframe needed. But even under capitalism, actually much more could be done. Biden could declare a climate emergency, which would unlock billions of dollars annually that could be used for the transition off fossil fuels to renewables. But I want to point out that studies do show that the US needs to spend $1 trillion annually over the next decade in order to meet its emission reduction goals. But at least a climate emergency would be a movement in the right direction and communicate to some degree the severity of the crisis. But without mass public pressure, even a declaration of climate emergency is very unlikely to happen. Like all progressive gains throughout history, change only comes when the masses of people threaten the continued profits of the ruling class. When the masses are largely silent, business as usual continues, even when facing societal collapse, as we are with climate change. And despite Biden's promises of climate action on the campaign trail, the US and other capitalist governments are actually increasing fossil fuel production. Just days before the COP26 climate summit in November, Biden urged OPEC nations to ramp up their oil production. And then just days after the summit, opened the largest lease auction for oil and gas drilling in US history. And the US government also continues to funnel $20 billion annually in subsidies to fossil fuel corporations. Another failure of capitalism to address the crisis is that it aims to simply recreate an electrified version of our current car culture in order to keep profits going to automakers. While electric vehicles are better for the climate than gas-powered, we can't just replace the current consumer society with a green version. To truly address environmental impacts that are causing the crisis, we need to scale down our carbon footprint, we need to reduce the need for individual car ownership, and build an efficient, accessible, zero-emission mass transit system and high-speed rail. One problem with the push for everyone to own an electric vehicle is that the mining of the rare earth minerals that are used in the batteries have devastating environmental impacts in the global south, where the majority of extraction occurs. And studies show that there aren't even enough of these minerals in existence to replace all gas-powered cars with electric, which results in extreme measures by corporations to secure these resources. There's now a proposal to scrape the ocean floor to extract these minerals, which would not only release massive amounts of carbon into the atmosphere that has been stored on the seafloor for millennia, but also be detrimental to sea life. Even though capitalism falls far short of addressing the problem, this doesn't mean that we shouldn't push for climate action under capitalism. We must fight for even minor progressive reforms within the system, while at the same time pointing out that capitalism is the root cause and that a socialist transformation of society is actually what's needed. And not only do we need action on climate change, but also on climate disaster preparedness and recovery for what's already unfolding. The government does little to nothing to help people get out of the way when disaster strikes, and just as little in recovery efforts. Low-income communities often never see any government assistance in times of crisis and instead have to organize their own relief efforts. Basically, under capitalism, we're all left to fend for ourselves. And with each disaster, the working class is driven into deeper poverty or literally left behind to die if they fail the means to evacuate. The rich, they can always move to a second or third home when one burns in a wildfire. They can afford the increasingly costly flood and fire insurance and increasing food prices. In general, the rich, including our so-called leaders, are able to go about their lives largely unaffected by climate change. It's working class people that froze to death in their homes last year in Texas. It's immigrant farm workers who die of heat stroke when forced to work in the fields during triple-digit heat waves. It's low-income communities that are forced to live in the floodplains of the Gulf Coast where the affordable housing exists. Capitalism provides as little as possible for the people on a normal day, and with climate change, the inequalities that already existed are only amplified. But there is another way. Socialist Cuba gets hit directly by intense hurricanes, more so than the US. Yet a person is 15 times more likely to die in a hurricane in the US than in Cuba. And why is that? It's because Cuba has a comprehensive hurricane preparedness system that mobilizes all of society. Everyone is educated and given assistance in advance on what to do and where to go before a storm hits, and is constantly updated on the progress of the storm as it approaches. And everyone is insured a home after the storm passes. No one is left behind because the well-being of the population is the priority. And this is in a country that has limited resources due to the 60-plus-year-long US blockade. Cuba also has a long history of conservation of their native habitats and a highly developed organic farming system led by their farmer-to-farmer agroecology movement that shares knowledge, methods, and resources among farmers. These agroecological methods provide higher yields and create a more resilient food system, which is crucial with increasing climate stressors like hurricanes and drought that the island is facing. And before Spanish colonization, forests covered around 90% of the island of Cuba, dropping to only 14% by the time of the 1959 revolution. Through a reforestation program that began in 1998, they now have around 31% forest cover. And Cuba also protects 25% of its territorial waters. Globally, less than 5% of ocean waters are protected. These protected areas have resulted in the most pristine and healthy coral reefs in the Caribbean, which are crucial habitats for species reproduction. In 2017, Cuba launched Project Life, which is a 100-year plan for climate change adaptation and addresses sea level rise as it relates to housing and agriculture. Can you imagine that here? Like, we can't get a plan for like 2 years or 4 years. The plan also focuses on restoration of reef systems and mangrove forests to help protect coasts from storms and absorb rising waters. In this photo, I had the honor of going to Cuba on an eco-tourism trip, and we got to see their coral nursery. They're having a lot of impacts on their reef from the hurricanes battering the reef. So after a storm passes, they collect all the broken pieces of coral and they regrow them on these underwater trees and then replant them back on the reef to help the reefs recover. And despite what we hear in the US media, communist China takes the lead globally in renewable energy production with more than 3 times the gigawatt capacity as the US. And in 2012, China's Communist Party wrote the goal of building an ecological civilization into their constitution and have since integrated this perspective into their development plans. China has also undertaken large-scale ecological restoration efforts, like a project in the Los Plateau that restored an area of depleted land the size of Belgium to a thriving agroecological area, bringing 2.5 million people of that region out of poverty. They also have the Great Green Wall, a 3,000-mile-long reforestation project on the edge of the Gobi Desert, which has inspired a project of the same name spanning the width of Africa on the southern edge of the Sahara. China has also achieved major reductions in particulate matter pollution in Beijing, with a 35% reduction over a 4-year period from 2013 to 2017, which is an unprecedented level of reductions for such a short time frame. I work in air quality regulation in the San Francisco Bay Area. If we saw a 0.5% reduction of a pollutant in that time frame, we'd celebrate. Like, it's unheard of. And it really demonstrates that what can be achieved when government has control over industry and transportation. China is also the largest producer of electric buses, with 420,000 of these buses operating in China as of May 2020, which actually accounts for 99% of the global fleet of electric buses. China also has the most extensive electric high-speed rail system globally, which connects urban centers through more than 23,000 miles of rail lines. And this number is expected to double in length by 2035. And these are just a few examples of how socialist countries are taking much more action to address the crisis. And it's because the system of socialism puts the control of production and the resources of society into the hands of the worker-led government. The scientists, ecologists, farmers, healthcare workers, indigenous leaders are the ones making decisions on what is best for society and the planet, because they understand the problems and solutions best. And instead of a free market capitalist economy where what is created is based on what is most profitable in the short term, a socialist planned economy bases what is produced on what is most needed by society while accounting for long-term sustainability. Before I end, I want to talk about some of the real solutions to climate change. First, we need to end fossil fuel production and rapidly shift to wind, water, and solar energy production. And studies show that the technology exists today to make this shift and still meet the world's energy needs. Unfortunately, nuclear and biofuels are lumped in with renewables and are heavily subsidized by the government and have a much greater environmental impact than true renewables. Life cycle emissions from nuclear are actually third highest after scrubbed coal-fired plants and natural gas. And nuclear plants are incredibly costly to build and take around a decade to construct, which is really impractical considering the short time frame we have for rapid reduction in emissions. Nuclear also, of course, has the unresolved issue of radioactive waste and the risk of catastrophic reactor failure. And biofuel production is one of the main drivers of deforestation globally and creates greenhouse gas emissions in the production process while also depleting soil and water resources and harming biodiversity through these like monoculture crops that they're using. Per capita, US energy consumption is over 10 times higher than Cuba's. So while shifting to renewable energy production is a key factor, we also need to greatly reduce energy consumption, which could be done in very simple ways like weatherizing all homes and upgrading all appliances to be the most energy efficient. And Cuba had this energy revolution where they distributed energy efficient appliances to 100% of the households in Cuba for free. And that helped them reduce their energy needs. Could easily be done here if we had a different system. Another way to reduce energy needs is to end long commutes and have jobs, schools, and recreation near to where people live while providing zero-emission mass transit. And of course, that would entail addressing the housing issue and the cost of housing so that people could actually afford to live near where they work. And we also need to convert our car-centered cities into green eco-cities and eco-villages like China and other countries are doing, where cities are walkable and bikeable and are part of the ecosystem, supporting biodiversity, increasing water resources, improving air quality, and cooling the climate. We must also end the industrial agriculture system, which is a major contributor to climate change and deforestation, and return to organic regenerative practices for growing food and raising livestock. Industrial monoculture methods rely on synthetic fertilizers, GMO seeds, and pesticides, herbicides, and fungicides that destroy the soil microbiome and poison humans, pollinators, and other species. These methods also erode topsoil and release carbon into the atmosphere through excessive tillage of the soil, creates ocean dead zones from nutrient runoff from the fields, and depletes freshwater resources due to the intense irrigation that monocultures require. And synthetic fertilizers are the main source of nitrous oxide, which is an even more potent greenhouse gas than methane and stays in the atmosphere for 120 years and has a warming capacity nearly 300 times that of CO2. So it's very dangerous. Writer and agroecologist Vandana Shiva calls the forcing of GMO seeds onto farmers as bioimperialism, which is threatening our global food system and has driven hundreds of thousands of farmers to suicide globally since the mid-1990s. Industrial methods are just a means for corporations to reap profits from the agriculture sector through forcing farmers into reliance on their products under the guise of providing food security. Regenerative organic methods produce higher yields of more nutrient-dense crops and greatly reduce or eliminate the need for irrigation. Planting a diversity of crops together, along with cover crops and trees, fixes nitrogen in the soil, increases soil moisture, naturally keeps away pests, and supports biodiversity. And instead of being a source of greenhouse gases, regenerative methods do the opposite by eliminating or greatly reducing the need to till the soil, which keeps carbon in the ground. And animal integration onto croplands and orchards increases soil fertility and can greatly reduce the negative impact of livestock production. And while moving away from industrial methods is key, we also need to greatly reduce meat and dairy production, particularly in the US. and end the inhumane and environmentally destructive industrial livestock production. 70% of crops grown in the US are actually grown for livestock feed, and as well as some for biofuels. So greatly reducing livestock numbers, restoring native grasslands, implementing regenerative grazing methods would significantly reduce climate impacts from this sector. And also 35 to 50% of food in the US is actually wasted, mostly in the distribution and production process. So eliminating food waste and redirecting what does exist to composting facilities would not only reduce the land mass needed for agriculture, but would also reduce methane emissions that come from landfills. And oceans are the largest carbon sink or carbon capture mechanism on the planet and provide around 70% of the oxygen that we breathe. Ocean restoration and protection is crucial, along with an end to overfishing and pollution that has caused a major decline in marine life. Restoring kelp forests, reef systems, wetlands, mangroves, seagrass beds would not only capture carbon and improve biodiversity, but would also reduce ocean acidification, absorb rising seas, and protect coasts from storms. Now I want to show, you can go to the next one and we can show the video. So this is an 11-minute video. You know, he's not at least openly a revolutionary, but it shows a really simple ecological solution to the problem of drought, fire, and flood. It's like really simple, low cost. It's basically like just helping Mother Nature along a little and restoring the cycle. And then after we show this, I have a few closing comments before we move to Q&A.
We live in a time of extremes, when cycles of flood, drought, and fire lead to vast humanitarian crises around the world. A time when humans are damaging the Earth's organs, the ecosystems that regulate our climate. It doesn't need to be this way. I've experienced and created landscapes stewarded by humans with an abundance of water and life, dripping with food. Here, this fruit tree is falling over with the weight of its own natural productivity, grown with no inputs, just by partnering with natural forces. In the Western world, we're really good at symptom-based medicine. If you have a runny nose, you treat the runny nose, rather than resolving the stress that's the root of the disease. I'm worried that right now, we're doing the same thing with climate change, focusing on the symptom rather than the root cause of the issue. Do you know how much of the global heat dynamics on Earth are regulated by carbon? Somewhere between 4 and 20%. How much is regulated by water? 70 to 95%. Water is Earth's blood, the elemental building block of life. In the natural state of the landscape, the water cycle is balanced and productive. For every ecosystem in the world, increasing interconnectedness leads to more productivity. In the shade of diverse vegetation, the soil is kept cool and moist, allowing it to quickly absorb the falling rain. That water feeds into the earth and returns as springs and creeks, keeping the water clear and cool, healthy rivers full of life. The sun evaporates moisture from the ocean, and the water vapor drifts inland. In order for water vapor to condense as clouds and fall as rain, it needs nuclei to form around. Some of the primary nuclei are hygroscopic microorganisms produced by trees as a byproduct of photosynthesis. Around these microorganisms, the water condenses, forming clouds and then rain. As vapor becomes liquid, it goes from very large to quite small. The volume change causes a change in air pressure. Like a vacuum, it draws water vapor inland from the coast. Trees act as a living water vapor pump, cooling the air and increasing the humidity. In the natural water cycle, biological systems are facilitating the movement of water from the oceans through the Earth's continent, a system called the biotic pump. Weather patterns are regular and balanced, with water available throughout the year. In the disturbed water cycle, human impacts lead to extremes. On the hot, exposed Earth, the water can no longer infiltrate. So like over a dry sponge, it runs downhill quickly, leading to flooding and erosion, followed by drought and then fire. Columns of hot air rise off the bare Earth, and when the water vapor from the ocean tries to enter, the hot air pushes back, causing the pressure to build. Once the pressure is strong enough, the storm system enters, and its force is destructive. During the short but intense storm, there's little opportunity for the soil to absorb the rain. This leads to stronger, more powerful storms, with longer periods of drought in between. Without the precipitation nuclei, the water vapor forms a warming haze, acting like a blanket, preventing heat from dissipating to the night sky. This is how humid deserts are created. In the disturbed water cycle, flood, drought, and fire all intensify as the climate becomes increasingly extreme and water increasingly scarce. Let's take a look at where we're at from a global analysis of our water budget. The prognosis is not good. Over the last 10,000 years, humans have desertified 1/3 of Earth's land. How did this happen? How could such a relatively small organism have such a tremendous impact? About 10 to 12,000 years ago, humans invented the plow and domesticated animals in the Middle East. With these two innovations, extractive agriculture began, as humans for the first time had a powerful ability to change the vegetative cover of the earth and keep it changed. This technology slowly moved around the earth, creating deserts in its wake. First, the Fertile Crescent, which may be hard to believe now, but was once one of the most fertile valleys in the world. Then, Northern Africa, around 6,000 to 8,000 years ago, creating the Saharan Desert where a rich savanna once was. Then moved across Asia and the rest of the world, even claiming the American West. In this image, most of the brown areas were green before human impact changed how water cycles through the landscape. But we face an even greater challenge now: urban development and the vast creation of hardscapes and draining of valleys. Here in this picture is Bogota, Colombia, but it could be nearly any city in the world. Everything you see in this picture, all of the buildings, the roads, it's all designed to drain the water away as quickly as possible. Not only that, but this city is in the bottom of a valley. The surrounding mountains feed their water into the valley, so that water is drained as well. So how do we begin to rebalance our water budget? By creating decentralized water retention landscapes, holding water within the earth, rehydrating the body with blood. Let me show you some of what's possible. Here is a community in Portugal, Tamera, living in a harsh, desertified landscape with severe water shortages. And here is the water retention landscape that was created there. It's important to note that this is done only using natural materials and seasonal rains, the resources that nature freely provides to us. How is a transition like this possible? Well, I'm truly standing on the shoulders of a giant, this man, Sepp Holzer, who through a lifetime of learning from and working with nature, sees not just the landscape as it is, but the ecological potential. And through experience, he knows how to realize that potential. Here in Montana, we took this heavily degraded wetland where people had created an airstrip. And after 11 days work and a couple months of natural processes, here is the ecological oasis it became. There's a growing movement of people around the world implementing these solutions. From what I've seen, once humans get a glimpse of what's possible, they don't just walk, but begin running in this direction. How do we know what's possible? One way is by looking into the past. This tree, Big Mama, was alive on Turtle Island before Columbus arrived. When she was young, you could drink from any source of water in North America. I read a recent report that stated in the Minnesota portion of the Missouri River Basin, they found that no lake met the state's quality standards for fishing or swimming. Think about that for a moment. From drinkable water everywhere to entire watersheds that aren't even fishable or swimmable. Humans have disturbed the hydrological balance of Earth, but we can also catalyze its restoration if we begin to work with and respect nature. In some ways, I feel as though in our rapid adoption of reductionistic science, we've lost all true understanding of the world. We reduce things down to the simplest terms so that we can more easily describe the complicated, but in the process, we lose sight of the whole. In many ways, as science advances, it's just starting to catch up to traditional ecological knowledge. An example of this, it's common knowledge in indigenous cultures around the world that the forests call rain. Western science thought this was preposterous, that forests grow in regions with high rainfall, and that's why these people get so confused. But now, the most advanced science is learning that indeed forests do call the rain. They produce the hygroscopic microorganisms that seed rainfall, accommodating for as much as 80% of the rainfall in the Amazon basin. If we look at the Amazon basin and consider that, if we cleared all the forests at once, it would not just become a savanna, but it would actually become a desert. The amount of precipitation would reduce by 80%. We need to carefully consider if we want the Amazon to remain forest or become desert. And those impacts will not just be felt by the people of Amazonia. The basin acts as a biotic pump, feeding moisture through the South American continent. If the forests disappear, so will the rainfall patterns in these regions. Not only that, but as these forested areas are cleared, columns of hot air begin rising off the exposed earth. The pressure of storm cells along the Atlantic coast builds, and some are forced off in different directions, leading to catastrophic flooding events in other regions. My plea to you is this: help rehydrate the Earth's body with blood. Hold water on the landscape, not only for you and your children, but for life, for water is life. Stand up for yourself, for our fellow brothers and sisters, the living beings with which we share this planet. A future of extreme climate, natural disaster, scarcity, and crisis, or a future of balance, abundance, health, and prosperity. It's not a matter of chance, but a matter of choice. So my question to you is simple. Which future will you help create?
There it is. So things like this and many more are happening on the local level around the globe in communities that have the resources and awareness of how to live in alignment with the planet. And this awareness is spreading, but not all communities have the resources. And it's urgent that we act quickly and on a mass scale to stem the crisis, which is why we need a nationally and globally coordinated effort with direct funding and training of workers to carry out this transformation. And to get there, we need to continue organizing our communities and educate each other about the solutions and demand that our government take real action that equals the urgency of the crisis. Studies show that despite growing concern about climate change, only 5% of the US population thinks there's anything that can be done to reverse it. If people don't know that there are solutions, they won't stand up and demand action, which is why it's so important that we educate others on this issue. And we must link struggles and build a class-conscious movement for climate justice across borders that is anti-imperialist, anti-racist, anti-capitalist, and pro-socialist. Because all the issues that the poor and working class of the world face, including the climate crisis, are rooted in the exploitative system of capitalism. Which is why we need socialism that puts the resources of society into the hands of the workers. It may seem that we're few and that they have all the power, but this is really just an illusion. There are millions around the globe working for real transformation of how humanity lives on the planet. You just won't read about it in the corporate media. And now more than ever, we need to harness our revolutionary optimism, our hope that is based in reality, and the understanding that humanity has the capacity to make the changes needed for our survival, and we must act now. Thank you. I think we're going to do Q&A. Did you want to make any comments?
Thank you for that amazing presentation, Tina. Have some questions for you. You said that change only comes when the masses of people threaten the continued profits of the ruling class, and that it will take a class-conscious movement for climate justice and socialism to combat the climate crisis. What advice can you offer us about building a popular movement for climate justice, specifically ways we can unite different struggles for economic and social justice with the struggle against the climate crisis?
Yeah, so, I mean, number one, we need to look at like what, are there struggles in our communities that are impacting folks that we can ally with, right? And like look for strategic struggles. Like for instance, when the deep freeze happened in Texas, all of our folks in Texas like immediately mobilized for a call for public power because it was the failure of this privatized grid that caused these people to freeze to death in their homes. So looking for those ways to find struggles locally and then connecting it to the bigger issue of climate. And also we need to be more, as leftists, as socialists, be more in the climate justice movement and pushing it to the left. I mean, there's lots of young folks in the movement that are anti-capitalist, but they don't necessarily understand socialism, and they aren't necessarily for socialism because they don't understand it. I think they would if they did. And it's dominated by NGOs, and and traditionally it's been very white and liberal movement, but that's what our role is, right? To get in that movement and push it to the left and make it revolutionary and tie it to all the other struggles, because it's the same as the abortion rights movement. Like it tends to be very pro-Democratic Party and liberal, but our job is to make it more radical, right? So we need to be more on the ground with folks and like pushing the radical politics for real change.
Hi, Tina. Yes, we have another question. So Climate Solutions offers us knowledge to better combat the misinformation, denial, and deep pessimism of the corporate media around the issue of the environment. You mentioned that studies show that much of the US population is aware and concerned about elements of climate change, but a much smaller percentage believes that there's actual solutions to address it. It's clear that we need to work towards lifting the consciousness and, as you said, the revolutionary optimism of the people. I want to know what fuels your revolutionary optimism?
Well, being a socialist, number one, right? And seeing the potential of the working class to take power and to change the system, right? I mean, it's happened globally in other places, and it can happen here, which is very important. It happens here since the US is the main driver of climate change. But yeah, I mean, I think folks, another role that we have as revolutionaries is to provide a vision to people of a positive possibility for a future, right? Because they're so bombarded by the corporate media, all you get are these articles about like, the bad shit that's happening, right? The doom and gloom, and also Hollywood like keeps churning out these post-apocalyptic like movies and shows and stuff. And it's like everyone's just constantly bombarded with a negative future vision. And as revolutionaries, we need to show what is possible if we, get rid of capitalism and restore the planet, like, and restore our own communities, like what that vision could look like, because it's so hard for people to see beyond their daily lives and to see beyond the system. But I think we all do because we're here, right? We're doing this work. So that's another role that we have in this struggle, right?
You stated clearly that to end the climate crisis, we need to build socialism and a political and economic system that puts power and resources into the hand of the working class instead of a small class of millionaires and billionaires. As we organize towards systematic change, are there any political reforms that can agitate and organize around here and now?
What was this, the last part of that?
Oh. Are there any political reforms that we can agitate and organize around here and now?
Well, like I said, looking for opportunities for struggle in our communities, right? Locally, building those alliances in our communities with those most impacted by either climate disasters or pollution, or, you know, and thinking strategically about it, right? Because we have a broader view of how to make social change, right? But yeah, and every area is different. You know, this is the 16th city I've spoken in, and it's like every area has different impacts from climate change, right? The West, we're all dealing with droughts and fires, and Gulf Coast is, you know, hurricanes getting worse every year, and so everyone's got a different issue, right? You all have the subways that flood every big storm, right?
In basements. Thank you. So we're going to open up now. If anybody has questions, you can raise your hand, and I'll come around. Wow, okay. Start over here.
Hi, thank you for being here. So I think something that's been really buzzy in like the climate change sphere recently is talking about green jobs, and even the new New York City mayor is very vocal about kind of green jobs being an emphasis of his administration. And I think they're often spoken about as being like pro-labor and, you know, climate solutions, but a lot of them, you know, aren't really helping workers, nor are they really deeply addressing climate change. So I'm curious kind of what you think a good model for a green jobs program would look like, both in terms of incremental change now and then kind of in a socialist future.
Yeah, I mean, there could be a massive, like there was under FDR in the New Deal, like a massive public works campaign where millions, really would need to be millions in this case, where workers are trained to do this work of building the renewable energy infrastructure and restoring ecosystems, shifting our agriculture. Like there's so much that could be done, and it could be done through the government, like a public works program. That would be the most effective. I don't know what these so-called green jobs really are, and you know, and who are they available to? I mean, under capitalism it's usually not all too green, and it's goes to the most skilled workers. You know, it doesn't really help train new folks. So yeah, that would be my thing. Like, yeah, we could have. I mean, it happened under capitalism once. That would be one thing that could happen again. But
Thank you.
Okay, I'll take two more.
Yeah, so I was wondering so you talked a lot about like how to restore these forest areas and how to create like a better future. But one thing that I was wondering about is what do we do with like plastics, like in the oceans and in just nature all around us? How do we fix that?
number one, we need to immediately stop producing it, which is another, industry that's highly subsidized. I mean, it's petrochemical companies, right? So it's another use for oil. And it's, stop creating things that are disposable. But yeah, to get it, the problem is, I reference a project in my book called the Ocean Cleanup Project, which has these, used to be about, but passive flotation devices that collect it all in the oceans. But it's still like all these microplastics now are like everywhere. It's in our bodies, it's in the air, it's in the snow, it's in the rain, it's just everywhere. That will just take, hundreds, possibly thousands of years to go away. There's nothing we can really, nothing that we know right now that we can do about that. But we need to stop producing it. I mean, we used to live without plastic. And we had decent lives. So yeah, it's really just one more industry that makes a lot of profits. So it's very profitable to keep churning out plastic stuff that's disposable and creating waste.
Another way that we talk about how to curb climate change is between gentrification, of course, and flooding. It caused a lot of bigger issues that we deal with over the past several years so far. So basically, how that to curb climate change, even in case of new development come through like every neighborhood that have been feared to affect the impact in coastal communities.
Yeah, with sea level rise, you mean? Correct. Yeah, yeah. I mean, like I said, like there are ways to shore up coasts using natural methods, like building reef systems and shellfish beds, and using natural materials, which are actually better than building like concrete seawalls, because it absorbs the power of storms as it comes. The natural methods absorb the power of storms and absorb water because they're living things, right? As opposed to a concrete wall, which just gets repels the giant waves, but it doesn't. It's not the best solution. In some communities at this point, I mean, the ice caps are melting. They will continue to melt even if we immediately have a socialist revolution and restore ecosystems. Some of that will already be lost, right? You can't undo that. But so some coastal communities will probably have to relocate. That's the reality of it, especially like the Miami, South Florida, which is, there's no way you can stop that water from coming. It's like already so low lying and it's basically limestone underneath the city. So the water just comes up from below, right? It's really, you can't build a wall for that.
Thank you so much. It was such a very interesting talk. And when you mentioned about agroecology, I had the opportunity to go to Nicaragua and in an agricultural brigade, and it's very impressive all the things that they are building there, and how you mentioned of not using GMOs and trying to take care of the soil, and how it goes beyond of the method of production, but also is an anti-capitalist struggle. And what the world is doing with La Via Campesina and trying to make it so that this knowledge from the indigenous peoples continue being replicated, it's very impressive. But all of that you don't hear in the news, and what's happening in Nicaragua, which is like wonderful, and you get to interact with the people there, with the agriculture, with the people that do agriculture, and all, as you said, all the things that you hear here is all the bad news, but once we break down, it's impressive what's going worldwide. It's more like a thing.
Yeah, thank you for that comment. That's great to hear it's happening in Nicaragua. I actually got to, it's called the Rodale Institute. It's headquartered in Pennsylvania, and I got to visit it last year and interview their chief scientists. And they not only do research on regenerative organic methods, they've been around since 1955, but they also train farmers in these methods. And they said they don't even have enough workers to train the farmers that want to learn these practices. So there's a big shift happening here too in the US of small farmers really wanting to get away from the indebtedness to these corporate, agriculture companies, right? And really shift not only, and for their own health and their family's health too. They don't want to deal with the poisons like in their homes and their farms. So yeah, it's spreading. This awareness and this shift in practices is definitely spreading globally.
Yeah, the press always seems to counterpose jobs in a local community with anti-pollution efforts. And it's so unfortunate because what they're doing is ruining the environment. But what would you say to a community that's being told, if you implement these anti-pollution measures or stop coal or whatever is causing the pollution, you're going to lose jobs? What would you say to that community? Because it's so sad the way they counterpose the communities against environmentalists. Thank you.
Yeah, and that's a hard one, especially if it's like a small rural community where there aren't any other jobs. Like the coal mine is the only place to work or something. It's a hard thing under capitalism. Like there could be ways to fight back, maybe, but it's a real struggle. Like even they always use that excuse though. The companies, it's like at the agency I work at, there's we'll try to make one regulation a little stricter on oil refineries, and they'll send all their workers to the board meetings complaining that they're going to get laid off because of, even though these companies, these are like the big ones, Chevron, like they make billions and billions of dollars in profits every year, right? So, but that's how it works, right? They'll lay off workers and they'll raise gas prices before they take cuts for the CEOs, right? But yeah, it's a hard struggle. I mean, build alliances, people need a paycheck to pay their bills. So it is a hard struggle, but building the bigger struggle and demanding that there's training for jobs, training for workers in new fields, right? A just transition to a renewable energy system. That is like a real one, a real just transition. where workers aren't left behind is so important.
Thanks, Tina. I'm Ben from the PSL. I when I read your book, and I was really struck by the immense number of solutions that are out there, and it just was so striking given the fatalism, defeatism, pessimism that I feel is so prevalent whenever this issue gets brought up, including in pop culture. Like they say, it's easier to envision the end of the world than a different world, that people just assume that it's already over, and that then suppresses people's desire or motivation to fight. And when I read the book, I was just thinking, well, it's obviously a question of power. It's not a question of a lack of ideas, it's who has power. And unfortunately, we're in the US, I think a lot of movements have been very segmented. There's the climate justice movement, the immigrant rights movement, police brutality movement. But when you think about it, all of these movements need power. Like without power, we're not gonna be able to change any of the things that we need to change. Otherwise, we're appealing for those who are in power already to make the changes. So there's like a basis for unity. And yet the climate justice movement has been known historically as one that's kind of apart from the other movements. And I want to know if you could speak to that. Like, how does the climate justice movement, move out of this kind of side issue, and how does it speak to and intersect and work with all the other movements for power?
Yeah, I mean, that's our goal, right? That is the work we have to do, is to build a unified worker movement in this country that is for climate justice, that is for immigrant rights, that is against police brutality, and link all these struggles, because that's the only way we're going to win. We can't be segregated and segmented anymore. Like, if we're actually going to take power, if we're actually going to overthrow capitalism, which we really urgently need to do for so many reasons. And you can see what's happening. I think people are starting to wake up. Like, everything's being taken back. The gains that were won, like the power of the EPA and women's rights, abortion rights, all these things that were won at one point in U.S. history by struggle are being taken back, and that will continue to happen absent of struggle. And it's a constant cycle, right? Until we win, the workers win power and secure these rights in a constitution. But yeah, we need to ally. Yeah, we need to ally with folks across borders and across struggles, and ally with indigenous communities that are fighting on the front lines of these, Standing Rock and Line 3 and these extractive pipelines and industries. It's hard because they're super isolated in the middle of nowhere usually, but we need to try to link struggles and somehow support each other. Building a unified, diverse, multinational, working class struggle for all these issues is the key.
Hi, thank you for being here, and thank you so much for the focus on land regeneration and water protection. I think that across the board is the solution. This question is a bit strategic, and it introduces a piece of information that not many folks are aware of, which is intentional weather modification and atmospheric modification that has been going on since the 1930s or 40s, with programs that kind of surfaced in the 1970s, like Operation Popeye, for example, which includes cloud seeding, storm production, hurricane manipulation. All of this, by the way, I'm happy to share with folks afterwards. It's on a website with primary sources, weathermodificationhistory.com, in case people want to look at it. But so the strategic question here, because you focus so much on saying we need to unify and we need to actually capture more people into this struggle. And something that I battle a lot with is just the divide and conquer strategy that is applied from the top, in that keeping people divided is actually functional to not having anything done at all. And so I'm thinking of all the folks that are called climate denialists, climate negationists, which are these epithets that are just thrown left and right, where some of these folks are, in my opinion, rightly doubting one of the mass media litanies that are thrown out there with big figures like Al Gore, and figures that are unfortunately captured by these others, such as Greta Thunberg, for example. So Al Gore was at my college some time ago, was talking about climate change and how we're gonna fix it with sustainable capitalism. I was like, oh my God. But then there is a tendency in which, with the Great Reset happening currently, the powers of the world are harnessing people's fears that are very much justified in order to apply certain programs that are not at all democratic, not at all socialist in the real sense of the word, but are like being imposed. So then what I feel inside myself is like, if we were able to show the rest of the population that doesn't necessarily share the ideology, which I think it's good to have diversity in ideology as well, but to be able to reach people and like not dismiss them as climate denialists, but just be able to appreciate that there is a level of power and a level of operations going on in the climate crisis that is not part of the public conversation. Like, how are we talking about climate change without talking about ionospheric heating, which is like secret technology that's not part, like it's not talked about. Could we then capture more of the population by triggering what I think is in the way of like having people actually distrust the government? Because a lot of people are just like, yeah, not sure about socialism. I'd be taught in school that it's like it didn't work in Russia, so I'm probably like not gonna go with it. But like if they saw that the government for the past 100 years has been doing things behind people's backs, such as modifying hurricanes and like heating up the ionosphere, would that possibly be a way to unify people in distrust of current powers and towards regeneration? Thank you.
Yeah, there's an interesting point to bring up about I didn't realize they had been tampering with the weather for that long. And one point on the climate deniers, the most outspoken climate deniers are totally linked to the Heartland Institute, and they're like actually like big, get lots of funding from fossil fuel corporations. So I question if they actually deny climate or whether it's just an opportunist talking point they have. But yeah, personally, I think like people are so bombarded with all the bad stuff, and they already do. I think most Americans, you look at how many people vote, I mean, they already have no faith that the government is going to do anything to help people. So I really feel like the most effective thing to do is to show that there are concrete solutions that are actually happening around the world and here as well on a small scale. Like people are working, there are solutions to this crisis. And we need, and use that as a motivator for people to move into action, right? As opposed to the negative, because I just feel people are so bombarded with the negative and they just shut down and they just don't want to hear anymore. Before I know there were solutions, I don't want to hear about climate change either because I didn't think there was any hope. So yeah, that's just my view. I feel like, yeah, focusing on the positive because we're so bombarded with the negative. I think the positive is more of a motivator for folks that there is hope and there is something they can do about it.
Thank you for talking to us. My question kind of relates overall to what we learned about earlier, so the different tangible solutions to climate change. And I also understand that it would take a collective consciousness for each of us to shift away and also reimagine our individual consumption in relationship to the earth. But then that's also weighed with the time crunch, the urgency of climate change. So how do you think each of us can, evaluate our own relationship to how we consume capitalism and all of that stuff, and as a society shift towards, being more collectivist and thinking about how our relation to each other and the earth affects all of us? Because it feels very impossible, because it would take a nation, like a globe, like everyone to really say, okay, I'm gonna change how much plastic I buy, where I food shop, how I interact with my everyday biome in society to actually make that change in such a short period of time also.
Right. Yeah, and a lot of folks don't have access to, sustainable purchasing or can't afford it or, don't have access to organic food or all these things. I mean, so much of the country is food deserts already. And so it's hard for people to make those shifts individually, and it is so systemic. Like if we don't change the production system, if we don't get rid of the profit motive, no amount of individual lifestyle choices will matter really. But we should, because once we have socialism, we will all be conservationists and live in a sustainable way. So it's good to. And it's a good way to talk to people about this issue, right? I don't know. There's a lot of urban gardens popping up, or urban organic gardens that are really providing food security for low-income communities. Like, if there's one of those in your neighborhood, like, get involved. Talk to folks about, like, hey, wouldn't this be great on a national scale? Why don't we have this on a national scale? If we had worker power, we would. Or a way. It's an endpoint to talking about the issue, and just building alliances in our communities. So there are little openings, you can look for in your own backyard, in your own community, where you can link the local struggle and in a healthy, positive way forward, right, with the bigger goal.
Yeah, thank you for the presentation. One of the things that I really like about your book is, like, in this matter of climate change and solutions, you are very open and clear about capitalism, and like there is no way, like, it's capitalism. So I think, like, thinking about that, right, like thinking about what you show it to us, the only thing I can think of is, like, if you bring socialism to the United States, you see the graphic with the highest, right, like a point, it would go down, and then, like, you can see this is a huge effect, not only to the people of this country, but like to the world, right? Like, and I feel like to assume that a solution will come from the same system, right? Like we are still in a pandemic. We just went through a pandemic, and this system let 1 million people die just because, right? Like they could have done so much more, right? Like, so I feel like even, right, like I'm not even talking about the people far away in another country. I'm talking about the people here that they just let die. And like what they would do to not let Mother Earth die, what they would actually care about Earth and care about, right, like environment. So I think like it put any hope on the system, right? Like we also seeing this happen, like what Tina was saying about all the wins that struggle brought being returned, right? Like overcoming, like the lack of struggle brings that, right? Like the lack of struggle keeps these people in power. So I feel like what we need to do, right, is not just find opportunity to mobilize and bring consciousness for climate change solutions, but I think we need to find opportunities to fight capitalism. I think we need to find opportunities. Right now, we have movements for the women's rights, on people's rights, right, like on abortion. We have like so many other movements going on, like about housing, about all the points that goes back to what? Capitalism and those people in power. So I feel like one of the best investment that people who live in the United States can do is the investment on socialism, is the investment on fighting capitalism and socialism. Because if you can, and it is not impossible. People overcome slavery in Haiti, people unite can overcome the most worst repressive system that is over them. And I think like investing on overcoming capitalism in the United States and bringing socialism here is gonna not only like help give Earth, it's not only the US, but like it's gonna give Earth like a huge, like a break, but also will give the rest of the world the break that they need to also invest in socialism in their countries, because their struggles are real and they exist, and they most of the time are overthrown by the United States capitalist imperialism. So we'll let the wave of struggles to also progress. So I think like if we want a future, not only for ourselves, not only for the Mother Earth, but if we want a future for the world, we need to bring socialism to this country. There is no other conversation. We need to overthrow capitalism. And this is not just like about climate change. It's not just like about one person, right? It's about like everything's connected. That's the only thing we can invest our lifetime, your action, your energy, is to raise consciousness of people that capitalism must go, and we need to bring socialism.
support your comments.
Okay. Hi. This has been fantastic. Thank you so much. I think we all know how demoralizing this work can be, especially with like compounding catastrophes. Everything just gets grief on grief on grief all the time. I'm curious how you take care of yourself and how you take care of your community.
Yeah, I have to say, I have my moments when, I feel the loss and I, feel the grief. But being in a revolutionary organization that has a perspective and a vision for a better future and a way to get there, and we're all over the country, we're growing every day, and it really, that without the organization, without the party, I don't know where I would be. I'd be very depressed because at my job, I honestly don't know how coworkers do it, because it's really a dead end, trying to address climate change through regulation on industry. It's like we have no time for this anymore. But yeah, it's really, being in an organization where people get it and we're all fighting together for the same goal, right, is a big help. I have my other, get out in nature a lot, that is a big resource for me too. But yeah, the party is sort of my grounding force.
Last question.
Thank you so much for your talk. Do you think that some of the scarcities that are brought about by climate impacts and other crises during the 21st century are going to pose any sort of fundamental or necessary threat to capitalism as an economic system? And do you think that has implications for revolutionary organizing?
Yeah, no one can predict what will cause a mass uprising, but it could be very likely a climate disaster or, scarcity that comes about because of climate change and rising food prices, for instance, because food prices will continue to rise, not just because of gas prices, but because things will be harder to grow as the climate gets drier and hotter. So yeah, it could be a spark that causes a mass uprising and a revolutionary opportunity. So that could really bring people together, unified against the system. So, but yeah, I don't have a crystal ball. I wish I did.
Is this on? Hi, everyone. I just wanted to make a quick plug. My name is Carolyn. I organize with the PSL, Party for Socialism and Liberation. We're actually going to put together a two-parts reading group for this book. It's a very short book. It's 60 pages. But for the next 2 Sundays, our PSL organizers in Queens are going to put together 2 parts of the reading group. And we're going to be reading in order to discuss how to create or wage a local campaign around climate crisis and connect it to all the local campaigns we've been waging for housing rights, immigration rights, and so on, because there are endless connections, there are endless opportunities. Capitalism sows the seeds of its own destruction. So join us. It's one thing to read to know, it's another to read to organize. So if you're interested in this study group, find me. I'll take down your information and get in contact with you. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Tina, for that incredible presentation. Your book, Climate Solutions Beyond Capitalism, and all of your contributions to the movement. Thank you to everyone who contributed to attending tonight's event. We give a special thanks to the People's Forum for hosting this event. Woo! And the People's Cafe for providing the wonderful food and drinks we had. Big round of applause. And we encourage anyone who wants to end climate catastrophe and environmental racism stop the U.S. war machine, and build a future where the needs of the people and the planet are met, to get involved with our organizations, Answer Coalition and the Party for Socialism and Liberation. Please sign up for notifications and connect with our organizers. We have sign-up sheets by the refreshment table. Let's merge study with struggle and theory with practice so we can lead and win this fight together. Again, we have copies of Climate Solutions Beyond Capitalism near the front for sale. We look forward to seeing you soon. Stick around to get to know each other. Please help us clean up before you go and make sure to head out by closing time. Thank you.